February 15, 1942. The tropical heat pressed down over Singapore as smoke curled above a shattered city. Buildings smoldered from days of bombardment. Streets lay littered with debris, and tens of thousands of weary soldiers huddled in silence. That afternoon, General Arthur Percival, commander of British forces, emerged from his headquarters carrying a white flag. He walked slowly toward the Japanese lines, his shoulders heavy with the knowledge that he was about to deliver the largest capitulation in British military history. Behind him, 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops awaited their fate. The enemy he surrendered to was not the overwhelming force London had imagined. General Tomoyuki Yamashita commanded barely 30,000 men, many exhausted and running low on ammunition. Yet his relentless advance down the Malayan Peninsula and the final assault on Singapore had created the illusion of unstoppable strength. For the defenders, reality was stark: water supplies dwindling, hospitals overflowing, and defensive lines collapsing. Churchill would later call it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. In London, disbelief turned to rage. How could the so-called Gibraltar of the East, touted as an impregnable fortress, fall in little more than a week of fighting on the island itself? The scene of Percival's surrender was starkly symbolic. Inside the Ford Motor Factory, converted into Yamashita's headquarters, the British delegation was led into a room stripped of ceremony. Percival, pale and drawn, faced Yamashita across a simple wooden table. The Japanese general, known for his sharp eyes and deliberate manner, demanded unconditional surrender. A soldier present later recalled how silence filled the room, broken only by the scratching of pens on paper as the surrender was signed. The war in Southeast Asia had reached its most humiliating moment for the British Empire. For the troops, the shock was visceral. Men who had fought for weeks, retreating through the jungles of Malaya only to defend street by street in Singapore, now laid down their arms. One Australian soldier later reflected that it felt as though all we had endured, the marches, the dead comrades, the hunger, had ended in a void. No victory, only silence. Civilians, too, understood the gravity of the day. Thousands had crowded into air raid shelters as Japanese bombs fell on Chinatown and the docks. Now, as news of the surrender spread, fear gave way to dread. They knew that Japanese occupation would bring harsh reprisals. Yet in Tokyo, the triumph was celebrated as proof of Japan's rising power. Yamashita himself confessed privately that his supplies were nearly exhausted, but his gamble had worked. By projecting strength, he forced an army 3 times his size into surrender. It was a psychological victory as much as a military one. The fall of Singapore sent shockwaves around the world. It shattered the myth of British invincibility in Asia and emboldened movements across the colonies that had long chafed under imperial rule. For the Allies, it was not just a loss of territory but a collapse of prestige. The empire had been humbled before millions of Asian eyes. As the Union Jack was lowered, the central question lingered like smoke in the humid air. How could this fortress, armed with heavy coastal guns and boasting the might of empire, have crumbled so swiftly? That question draws us backward in time, to the interwar years when Britain built Singapore into its great bastion in the east, a fortress designed to deter Japan, but fatally flawed from the beginning. The story of how illusions of strength turned to ash begins long before the surrender, in the years when Singapore was believed to be impregnable. The story of Singapore's downfall did not begin in 1942, but in the years before the war, when British planners convinced themselves that the colony was unassailable. In the 1930s, Singapore was hailed as the Gibraltar of the East, the crown jewel of Britain's far eastern defenses. Its naval base, completed in 1938 at Sembawang, was the largest dry dock in the world outside Europe, capable of housing the Royal Navy's biggest battleships. The fortress bristled with 15-inch coastal guns, airfields dotted the island, and officials boasted that no enemy could ever hope to take it. But the strength of Singapore was more illusion than reality. The massive artillery batteries were fixed, trained out to sea against an enemy fleet that never came. To the north, across the narrow causeway from Malaya, thick jungle and swamps were assumed to be impenetrable. Few imagined that modern armies could advance through such terrain. One British officer would later recall that his superiors insisted the jungle was our best defense, a dangerous assumption that would cost dearly. The flaws were not merely military, but political. London's strategy relied on the Singapore strategy, a plan that in the event of war, the Royal Navy would dispatch a fleet from Europe to defend the colony. Yet when crisis came in 1941, Britain was already overstretched, fighting for survival in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. No fleet could be spared. The fortress that was meant to be backed by naval supremacy was left dangerously exposed. Underlying these miscalculations was a deeper arrogance. Many colonial administrators underestimated Japan's capabilities, dismissing its forces as inferior and its technology as outdated. British newspapers reassured readers that Japan lacked the industry and discipline to challenge the empire. Civilians in Singapore lived in a bubble of confidence, frequenting clubs, racecourses, and cinemas, convinced that the British flag guaranteed safety. One local resident later remembered that the colony felt more like a resort than a fortress, where few believed war could ever reach them. Yet Japan had been preparing for years. Its victories in Manchuria and China revealed a military that was modern, ruthless, and relentless. By the late 1930s, Japanese forces had proven themselves adept at rapid, mobile warfare. Aircraft production soared, and the Imperial Army studied ways to fight in jungle terrain. Still, in Singapore, planners clung to the belief that any attack would come by sea. The great naval base itself was unfinished in its most critical aspect. It had no fleet. The battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse were dispatched in late 1941 as a deterrent, but without air cover, both were sunk within days of Japan's entry into the war. Their loss exposed the hollow core of the fortress strategy. Meanwhile, Singapore's defenses on the landward side were minimal. Roads through Malaya were poor, but they existed, and Japanese troops would later turn bicycles into weapons of speed, racing down the peninsula with shocking pace. British and Commonwealth troops stationed in Malaya were poorly trained for jungle warfare, accustomed instead to open battlefields. Supplies were limited, coordination weak, and morale brittle. The illusion of safety fostered complacency even among civilians. Families filled the grand hotels, traders bustled in the port, and children played in the shadow of the great guns. Few could imagine that within just a few years, those same guns would fire desperately inland, shells useless against the tide of Japanese infantry advancing from the north. In hindsight, the impregnable fortress was built on assumptions rather than realities. Singapore had strength on paper, but its weaknesses were glaring: vulnerable approaches, an absent fleet, and an enemy underestimated at every turn. The stage was set for disaster. As the 1930s gave way to war, these illusions would be shattered. When Japan struck in December 1941, it did not come by sea, but by land, cutting through Malaya with speed and ferocity that no British commander had anticipated. The fall of illusions was about to give way to the fall of Malaya, and the desperate retreat that would bring the war to Singapore's very doorstep. On the night of December 7, 1941, while American battleships burned at Pearl Harbor, another assault began half a world away. Before dawn, Japanese troops splashed ashore at Kota Baru, on the northeastern coast of Malaya. It was the opening strike in a campaign that would become one of the most stunning advances of the Second World War. Within hours, British and Commonwealth troops were fighting for survival. The commander of the invasion, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, had only 60,000 men, far fewer than the Allied total spread across Malaya and Singapore. Yet Yamashita wielded speed, ingenuity, and overwhelming air power. Japanese aircraft dominated the skies, striking airfields, destroying Allied planes on the ground, and crippling any hope of resistance from above. Bombers raided Singapore itself within hours of the invasion, shattering the illusion of safety among civilians. The advance down the Malayan Peninsula defied every British expectation. Japanese units moved swiftly through terrain dismissed as impenetrable jungle. Their secret weapon was simple: the bicycle. Soldiers pedaled mile after mile along narrow roads, carrying rifles and supplies, able to outpace retreating Allied units. When tires burst, they rode on rims, pushing forward with relentless determination. Allied troops, bogged down by vehicles unsuited for the terrain, were repeatedly outflanked. At Gibraltar, on December 11th, the British 11th Indian Division tried to hold a defensive line. Poor communication, heavy rain, and a coordinated Japanese assault broke the position within 2 days. Hundreds were killed, and the division was forced into a chaotic retreat. One officer later recalled the scene. It was not a withdrawal, it was a rout. Men abandoned their equipment and fled through the mud. Further south, the disaster repeated itself at Slim River in early January 1942. Japanese tanks, thought incapable of moving through the dense terrain, launched a surprise thrust along the main road. They smashed through the Indian 11th Division's lines, crushing artillery positions and scattering infantry. In hours, 2 brigades were destroyed. Survivors described the attack as a nightmare of fire and metal, with tanks bursting out of the morning mist and rolling over defenders who had no effective anti-tank weapons. The retreat continued through Kampar, where British and Indian forces made a determined stand in late December. For 4 days, they fought with skill and bravery, inflicting heavy casualties on the Japanese. The high ground gave them an advantage, and soldiers dug into the limestone hills held firm against repeated assaults. But Yamashita's strategy was not to waste time. He simply bypassed the position, cutting supply lines and forcing yet another withdrawal. Kampar showed what Allied troops could achieve under competent leadership, but it also underscored the hopelessness of their situation. Everywhere, Japanese tactics exploited British weaknesses. Air superiority allowed near-constant strafing runs and bombing raids. Supply lines collapsed as convoys were ambushed, and food and ammunition were abandoned in the rush south. Retreating soldiers often destroyed their own stores to prevent them falling into enemy hands, leaving themselves with nothing. Civilians clogged the roads, pushing carts and carrying children, while columns of exhausted soldiers trudged past, rifles slung low, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Eyewitness accounts painted a grim picture. One British private wrote in his diary, "We marched until our feet bled, but still they were behind us." It felt as though the jungle itself belonged to them. Another recalled the terrifying sound of bicycles rattling in the dark as Japanese patrols slipped past Allied positions to strike from the rear. By late January 1942, the Japanese had advanced over 600 miles in just 55 days. The vaunted Fortress Singapore was now directly threatened. Bridges were blown in desperate attempts to slow the enemy, but nothing stopped their advance. The causeway across the Johor Strait, connecting Malaya to Singapore, became the last line of retreat. British engineers prepared it for demolition, knowing the enemy was only hours behind. The speed and ferocity of the campaign shocked the world. Yamashita's army had achieved what Allied planners considered impossible, a lightning strike through jungle terrain, shattering a larger, better-equipped force. For the British Empire, the retreat down Malaya was not just a military failure, but a humiliation, exposing arrogance and underestimation at every turn. As February approached, Singapore, once called impregnable, stood isolated, its defenders weary and demoralized. The Japanese had reached the gates of the fortress, and the final act of Britain's Far Eastern catastrophe was about to begin. The fall of Malaya was complete. Now the fate of Singapore itself hung in the balance. By the final days of January 1942, the last Allied troops streamed across the causeway from Johor into Singapore. Behind them, engineers detonated explosives, sending a column of fire and smoke into the sky as the bridge collapsed into the waters of the Johor Strait. It was a desperate attempt to slow the Japanese, but few believed it would hold them back for long. The fortress of Singapore, once hailed as the Gibraltar of the East, was now cut off, surrounded, and bracing for the storm. From the very moment the Allies withdrew onto the island, the Japanese unleashed relentless bombardment. Dive bombers screamed overhead in daylight raids, while heavy artillery across the strait thundered through the nights. Shells crashed into docks, barracks, and neighborhoods, igniting warehouses and fuel depots. Fires raged across Chinatown, painting the night sky in hues of orange and red. Civilians huddled in cellars, clutching children as plaster and glass rained down from above. One survivor later recalled the terror. The walls shook, the air filled with dust, and all we could do was pray that the next bomb would not find us. Singapore's hospitals were overwhelmed. Corridors overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians alike. Doctors worked by candlelight as power flickered, while supplies of bandages, morphine, and food dwindled. Nurses carried buckets of water from broken pipes, stepping carefully over rows of men lying on stretchers. The city, once a gleaming colonial hub, had been transformed into a battlefield. On the military front, British and Commonwealth commanders scrambled to form defensive lines around the island. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, commanding the garrison, faced nearly 85,000 men, British, Australian, Indian, and local volunteers. Yet many were exhausted, having fought through the retreat down Malaya. Equipment was in short supply, ammunition was rationed, and morale was dangerously low. Worse still, the defensive strategy proved fatally flawed. Expecting the Japanese to attack from the northeast, Percival concentrated his strength there, leaving the western shoreline lightly defended. On February 8, 1942, as darkness fell, the Japanese struck. Under cover of artillery and smoke, General Yamashita's forces crossed the Johor Strait in hundreds of small craft. Landing near the mouth of the Kranji River on the northwest coast, they encountered only scattered resistance. Australian units, positioned along the beaches, fought bravely but were outnumbered, outflanked, and hammered by Japanese fire. In some places, defenders fired until their ammunition ran dry, retreating into the jungle as the enemy poured ashore. Within hours, the Japanese had established a beachhead. By dawn, tanks and artillery were landing, rolling off makeshift barges. The defenders fell back, and the battle spread into Singapore's interior. Shellfire and small arms fire echoed through villages, plantations, and reservoirs. Soldiers dug foxholes in the red earth, only to be driven out by waves of infantry. The defenders' line crumbled, and chaos spread through the ranks. Meanwhile, the civilian population suffered under the unrelenting assault. Fires consumed whole districts. In Chinatown, narrow streets became infernos, with families fleeing through smoke-choked alleys carrying bundles of possessions on their backs. Water mains shattered, leaving firefighters powerless. Refugees streamed toward shelters, many cut down by shrapnel or strafing aircraft before they arrived. A volunteer later wrote that the city burned like a torch, and the sky glowed as if the world itself was ending. The Japanese advance continued swiftly. On February 10th, they seized Tenga Airfield, depriving the Allies of one of their last operational runways. By February 11th, they had reached the outskirts of the city. Percival's troops fell back again, forming a shrinking defensive perimeter around the heart of Singapore. Ammunition dumps were nearly empty, fuel reserves almost gone, and the water supply was under direct threat. Civilians and soldiers alike dug shallow trenches in parks and gardens, bracing for house-to-house combat. Street fighting erupted in several quarters as Japanese units pushed into urban areas. Grenades exploded in shop fronts, while machine gun nests were set up in shattered buildings. Civilians caught between the lines endured horrors beyond imagination. One witness remembered stumbling through burning streets littered with rubble and bodies, as if civilization itself had collapsed. By February 13th, the battle had reached its climax. Japanese artillery bombarded the water reservoirs, threatening to cut off Singapore's last source of clean water. Hospitals, already overcrowded, now struggled with outbreaks of disease. Soldiers too weak from hunger or dehydration to fight surrendered in groups, while others, still determined, fought until they were overrun. The impregnable fortress was collapsing from within. As the fires burned and the lines buckled, it was clear to many that the end was near. Yet orders from above demanded resistance to the last. Civilians, once promised the protection of Britain's greatest stronghold in Asia, now realized that salvation would not come. The Japanese were inside the gates, and Singapore was on the brink of catastrophe. The siege had become a nightmare, and the final surrender was only days away. By mid-February 1942, Singapore teetered on the edge of collapse. Japanese troops under General Tomoyuki Yamashita had forced their way deep into the island, cutting through British and Commonwealth defenses with astonishing speed. Yet behind the facade of momentum lay a precarious reality. Yamashita's army was running dangerously low on ammunition and supplies. His artillery could fire only a limited number of shells per day, and his troops lived on rations stretched to the breaking point. Still, he pressed forward, knowing that speed and psychological pressure could deliver victory before the British realized his vulnerability. Inside Singapore, the situation was dire. Japanese tanks rolled through smashed suburbs while infantry advanced from one ruined street to the next. Explosions echoed through the city, and thick smoke billowed from fuel depots and warehouses still burning from earlier air raids. Hospitals overflowed, water supplies were failing, and tens of thousands of civilians huddled in makeshift shelters with little food. Survivors later recalled the stench of uncollected corpses, the cries of the wounded, and the gnawing hunger that spread like a second enemy through the besieged city. General Arthur Percival, commander of the British garrison, faced an impossible choice. With roughly 85,000 troops still under his command, British, Australian, Indian, and local units, he possessed numbers that, on paper, dwarfed Yamashita's force. But numbers meant little when morale was broken, ammunition stocks were dwindling, and defensive positions were collapsing under pressure. Some of his officers urged a desperate counterattack to retake lost ground, but Percival knew it would likely end in slaughter. Others pressed him to surrender, warning that continued resistance would unleash devastation on Singapore's civilian population. Yamashita, aware of his own weakness, played his hand with masterful deception. He ordered his forces to spread out, making noise and launching attacks from multiple directions to give the impression of overwhelming strength. Japanese aircraft circled constantly overhead, reinforcing the illusion of air superiority even as fuel shortages grounded many squadrons. Prisoners of war were released back into Singapore with rumors of vast Japanese reserves waiting just beyond the front lines. He fought with shadows, one historian later wrote, and made them look like giants. By February 14th, Japanese troops had seized key reservoirs, cutting off much of the city's water supply. Civilians queued at broken pipes, filling pots and buckets with whatever trickle remained. Food stocks were running low, with bread and rice rationed in meager portions. In some districts, looting broke out as desperate families scavenged for survival. A British private later described the atmosphere in his unit. "We had rifles, but no bullets, rations, but no water." Every man knew the end was near. On the morning of February 15th, Yamashita issued his ultimatum. A message was sent to Percival: surrender immediately or face total destruction. It was a bold bluff. Yamashita could not have sustained a prolonged battle, but Percival had no way of knowing that. In his headquarters at the Fort Canning bunker, Percival conferred with his commanders. Maps lay scattered across the table, marking front lines that no longer held. Reports of Japanese tanks entering new districts arrived by the hour. The water situation was catastrophic. With civilians already dying in the streets, Percival feared that refusing the ultimatum would bring mass slaughter. That afternoon, under a flag of truce, Percival and his staff walked through the smoking ruins of the city to the Japanese headquarters at the Ford Motor Factory. Witnesses remembered the silence of the streets, broken only by the distant rumble of gunfire. At Yamashita's table, Percival sat stiffly as the Japanese general pressed him for unconditional surrender. The meeting was tense and brief. Percival, exhausted and grim, signed the surrender at 6:10 p.m. With one stroke of a pen, 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops laid down their arms before a Japanese force less than half their size. It was the largest capitulation in British military history. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later call it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. For the men who surrendered, the ordeal was only beginning. Tens of thousands were marched into captivity, where disease, starvation, and forced labor would claim many more lives. As darkness fell on February 15th, Singapore was silent. The Gibraltar of the East, once thought impregnable, had fallen in barely 10 weeks. Yamashita's gamble had paid off, and Britain's prestige in Asia lay shattered. The stage was set not only for Japanese domination of Southeast Asia, but for one of the darkest chapters in the history of the British Empire. The guns fell silent on the evening of February 15, 1942. But for the soldiers and civilians of Singapore, the nightmare was only beginning. Within hours of the surrender, Japanese troops rounded up tens of thousands of British, Australian, and Indian soldiers. Exhausted, many marched with hands raised, their heads bowed in disbelief. They had fought for weeks through bombardment and hunger, only to be herded into captivity by an enemy force that had been half their size. The men were stripped of weapons, equipment, and dignity. Columns of prisoners snaked through the ruined streets, some barefoot, others still clutching bloody bandages from untreated wounds. Survivors recalled the heat, the dust, and the silence broken only by the barked orders of Japanese guards. One soldier later wrote, "We thought surrender meant rest. Instead, it was the beginning of hell." Their destinations were grim. Many were packed into overcrowded camps in Changi, once a British barracks, where food was scarce and disease rampant. Others were shipped north, crammed into airless railway wagons, bound for Burma and Thailand. There, under the tropical sun, they were forced to carve the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway from jungle and rock. The line would later be called the Death Railway. And for good reason. Tens of thousands of prisoners died of starvation, exhaustion, cholera, and beatings. Some camps reported death rates of 1 in 3. Civilians fared little better. European families were interned in camps where rations were barely enough to survive. Asian civilians faced the brutal realities of occupation. The Japanese imposed forced labor, food requisitioning, and strict curfews. In Singapore, thousands of Chinese men were executed in mass purges known as the Suk Ching massacres, accused of anti-Japanese sympathies. Whole families disappeared overnight, their bodies later discovered in shallow graves along the coast. Survivors remembered the terror of midnight knocks on doors, when soldiers dragged fathers and sons into the streets, never to be seen again. Churchill, in London, was enraged. He called the defeat an appalling disaster, the worst in British history. Yet rage could not mask the humiliation. Britain's prestige in Asia had been shattered. The myth of European invincibility was gone, replaced by the bitter truth that a colonial empire could crumble in mere weeks. To Asian populations long under colonial rule, the fall of Singapore was proof that the old order could be challenged. Across Malaya, Burma, and India, nationalist movements drew strength from Britain's weakness. The collapse of the impregnable fortress marked not just a military defeat, but the beginning of the end for the British Empire in Asia. For the prisoners, however, survival was the only thought. Diaries smuggled from camps spoke of hunger so fierce that men boiled weeds and insects for sustenance. Some traded their last possessions, watches, boots, even wedding rings, for a handful of rice. Others wasted away in silence, their bodies consumed by malaria or dysentery. Acts of kindness flickered amidst the misery, a prisoner sharing his ration, a hidden prayer service, a song sung quietly in the dark. But cruelty was constant. Guards beat men for stumbling under loads of timber. Escape attempts ended in executions, the bodies displayed as warnings. The war would grind on for more than 3 years before liberation came. By then, tens of thousands were dead, and the survivors bore scars, physical and emotional, that never fully healed. One veteran recalled, "When I was freed, I weighed less than half my former self. But worse than my body was the emptiness in my spirit." The fall of Singapore had begun as a military disaster. In its aftermath, it became a human tragedy of staggering proportions. For Britain, it was the loss of an empire's pride. For the men and women who lived through it, it was the loss of years, of dignity, and, for many, of life itself. Yet even in this darkness, the fall of Singapore had sown seeds of change, for Asia, for the empire, and for the world beyond. The fall of Singapore was more than the collapse of a city. It was the collapse of an idea, the illusion of British invincibility in Asia. For decades, the Union Jack had flown proudly over Singapore, proclaimed as the Gibraltar of the East. Yet in February 1942, it came down in humiliation. Winston Churchill would call it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British military history. For Britain, the surrender marked the beginning of an irreversible decline. The empire had been built on the perception of strength, but Singapore exposed its fragility. News of the defeat reverberated through colonial capitals from Rangoon to Delhi. In India, nationalist leaders pointed to the surrender as proof that the British Raj could be broken. In Malaya, Burma, and across Southeast Asia, subject peoples saw that white rulers could be defeated by an Asian power. The psychological shock was as devastating as the military loss. For Japan, Singapore represented the zenith of its expansion. General Yamashita's gamble had paid off, delivering a stunning victory that reverberated worldwide. But it was a high tide. Within 3 years, Japan's empire would crumble under the weight of Allied counteroffensives, its conquests unsustainable. Singapore became both a symbol of triumph and the point where Japan's overreach began. The legacy also lived in the memories of those who fought and suffered. Veterans remembered Singapore not as a battlefield of glory, but as a bitter lesson in leadership and preparedness. One British officer later reflected that arrogance, underestimation of the enemy, and failure to adapt had doomed the defense before the battle began. Survivors of captivity carried lifelong scars from the years of forced labor, starvation, and brutality in Japanese prison camps. For them, the fall was not only a military defeat, but a personal tragedy etched into their bodies and spirits. Today, the silence of memorials in Singapore tells the story. At Kranji War Cemetery, row upon row of white headstones mark the final resting place of those who never returned. The inscription at the memorial reads, "They died for all free men." In the heart of the city, plaques and museums preserve the memory of the siege, the surrender, and the suffering that followed. For visitors, the sites stand as solemn reminders of the cost of complacency and the cruelty of war. The fall of Singapore reshaped the strategic map of the Pacific War. It left Australia exposed, forcing its leaders to look to the United States for protection rather than Britain. It shifted Allied planning, redirecting resources to halt Japan's advance through the Pacific Islands. And it transformed the global balance of power, hastening the end of European colonial dominance in Asia. In the final reckoning, the fall of Singapore endures not simply as a military defeat, but as a turning point in history. It revealed the limits of empire, the perils of arrogance, and the cost of unpreparedness. Churchill's words still echo, tying back to that fateful moment when General Percival walked under a white flag, the worst disaster in British military history. Singapore was lost in 1942, but its lessons remain timeless. The city's fall reminds us that the mightiest empires can falter, that wars are decided not only by numbers and weapons, but by foresight, adaptability, and respect for the enemy. Above all, it endures as a warning that the greatest defeats are those born not of weakness alone, but of misplaced confidence.